We have to work pretty hard to get inside the heads of Chinese military leaders to understand why they thought that the AK-47 was a lousy weapon for a force like theirs, which was a Maoist People's War force. To hear them tell it, a force like the Viet Cong should have relied on SKSs. That would be better than AK-47s. Now, history has shown us differently. When you think Maoist insurgency or freedom fighter, you think of AK-47. Heck, you think of any low-budget developing world force, you think AK-47 or Kalashnikov family. What makes it even stranger is that the Vietnamese and a lot of the other insurgency forces got their AKs specifically from China. What they were using, in large measure, are not Soviet-made Kalashnikovs, but Chinese Type 56 submachine guns exported by the Chinese government expressly for the purpose of being used by those forces in their national liberation movements. So this makes a great paradox. Why did China think that the AK was suitable for everybody else's Maoist force, but not for their own? The answer is not simple, but it's a puzzle that actually fits together if you understand what the Chinese leaders were thinking and what they valued. Okay, let's start. Many of you know the background story, but the Kalashnikov, specifically the Type 3 AK-47, arrived in China and entered Chinese service in 1956 and began being manufactured by the Chinese themselves as the Type 56. And as we said before, the People's Liberation Army classified it the same way the Soviets had classified the Kalashnikov originally, as a submachine gun. As you know, the Soviet Union originally called it a submachine gun because that's the niche that it filled in the squad weapon system that they had in mind back in the 1940s. That was before they found out that it was so good for them as a service rifle as well as a submachine gun that they just collapsed the two roles into one. And as we've seen before, in Chinese nomenclature, it took a long time for there to be a clear distinction and a word for a light machine gun as opposed to any other kind of automatic weapon. We've mentioned this before, but for a long time, the Chinese would just call anything a 手提机枪 or handheld or portable machine gun that could be fired automatically and carried and operated by one person without need of a tripod, without some kind of belt feeding system or an assistant gunner, without a crew. If it fired automatically, if it didn't have a crew, it was a portable machine gun in Chinese nomenclature, even if it shot pistol caliber rounds. The nomenclature had changed by the time the PLA got the Kalashnikov, but the mindset was still in place. And the Chinese army chose to adopt the SKS and the AK-47 in the roles that the Soviets had originally developed them for, namely the SKS as the general service rifle and the Kalashnikov as the submachine gun, not the main weapon, but an adjunct. In the Chinese case, there would be 2 in each squad of 9 guys. For that purpose, the PLA thought the Kalashnikov was satisfactory. It made a good enough submachine gun. I think they weren't completely happy with it being as overpowered as it was, but they weren't going to look a gift horse in the mouth. The Soviets gave them the plans for this submachine gun, and they were going to put it to use. And it was great that it used the very same ammunition as their rifle, the SKS, and as their light machine gun, the RPD. That was perfect. It made a nice, tidy Type 56 family for the PLA. You had a Type 56 rifle, the SKS. You had a Type 56 submachine gun, the Kalashnikov. And you had a Type 56 light machine gun, the RPD, all firing the same caliber. This was great. For the first time in PLA history, everybody had a weapon and it shot the same round. And this would be true across the PLA once they finally made enough of these Type 56 family weapons that they could finally phase out all those weapons. Now, of course, we know that by 1956, the Soviets had already seen the light concerning the SKS. They had already replaced the SKS as much as they could with a Kalashnikov, and they made that the general issue weapon for line infantry. And the Soviets recommended that the Chinese should do exactly the same thing. Forget about the SKSs, or maybe reserve them for rear echelon troops. Give your frontline units over entirely to Kalashnikovs. Now, this is where it gets weird. For reasons of their own, the PLA leaders thought the Soviets were completely out of touch when it came to Chinese realities. They weren't crazy. See, they understood that under textbook circumstances, a Soviet army rifleman was going to use his Kalashnikov as part of a huge mechanized attack, together with his whole regiment, 3,000 guys. First, there would be this hellacious artillery bombardment that would soften up the enemy. And then companies of tanks would charge forward, and they would be followed right behind by whole battalions in armored personnel carriers. And then the individual riflemen would dismount from their armored personnel carriers and cover the last 200 meters on foot. They would be screaming obscenely, firing from the hip in full auto with their Kalashnikovs. And at that point, the little rifle bullets that they were shooting without really aiming would just be the cherry on top of this enormous mechanized, metallic, explosive attack by the whole regiment. Men and machines would be marching forward in unison, firing every weapon they had at the enemy line, and by now, the enemy would be disintegrating like wet toilet paper. So the individual rifleman with his Kalashnikov, he was just a drop of water in this huge hurricane of heavy weapons. A little tiny cog in this great big terrible industrial threshing machine of slaughter that was chopping up human life. That was the Soviet army. The PLA knew that it would be decades before they could even dream of such a thing. And their Soviet advisors confirmed that for them. For the foreseeable future, the PLA was a mostly infantry force. They would be supplemented by better artillery. They would be moved around and supplied on trucks. But the PLA did the math, and they figured, look, if we're not going to be doing this big Soviet-style regimental attack, it makes sense for us to rethink, what do we want from a rifle, given how we actually think we're going to be fighting? What they concluded was the AK-47 was really a rich man's weapon. I know this sounds lunatic from a modern perspective, but they didn't know what we know in 1956 about how the history of insurgency and guerrilla warfare was going to play out. The way they saw it, the Kalashnikov was well conceived for the peculiar conditions of the Soviet military, which had a wealth of machines, but a paucity of training time. From their perspective, the Kalashnikov was just a typically Soviet hardware solution to a software problem, namely, a way to skirt the difficulty of teaching all the subtleties of rifle marksmanship to some unmotivated short service conscript from Uzbekistan, who in any case was probably going to be fighting with a ton of armor and artillery anyway. No, the PLA thought, hardware solutions only work for countries that are rich enough to afford the needed hardware. China could and did manufacture Kalashnikovs, but the PLA still thought the Kalashnikov only made sense as a general issue rifle if you had the whole rest of a Soviet mechanized and you could operate it together with rockets and radar and radios. The way PLA leaders saw things, they didn't suffer from the shortage of training time that the Soviet army did, where the Soviet army had 2 years to train a conscript. One thing the PLA did have was recruits that they could keep for a good long time, who would learn their craft as infantrymen and didn't need a hardware solution to make that training problem go away. So if you could say that Western armies spent steel to save flesh, and the Soviet army spent steel to save training time, the PLA opted to use training to save on both steel and flesh. That is, they could afford to pick a less potent or advanced weapon and then compensate for it with better training. And sure enough, the PLA veered way far away from the Soviet Army in their thinking about rifle marksmanship training. In fact, the PLA lined up a lot more closely with the American approach. The US Army, of course, believed in firepower and mass just as much as the Soviets did. But in keeping with American shooting traditions, it prized individual rifle marksmanship highly, and it stressed training precise, long-range, semi-automatic fire. And the PLA leaders concurred. Just like the American military of the day, the PLA wanted their basic riflemen to leave automatic weapons to someone else with more experience and better judgment and skill. And they wanted the basic riflemen to contribute to the fight with well-aimed semi-automatic fire. Sure, the Chinese army couldn't afford as much range time as Western armies, but that was all the more reason for them to make their shots count. And then, too, the Chinese military just didn't like the AK-47 that much. In their mind, it had all kinds of faults. It lacked any kind of a bayonet. Even if you added one, they still thought it would be too short for bayonet fencing. The big banana magazine would keep a soldier from hugging the ground to shoot in the prone position. The AK had less effective range than the SKS because of its shorter barrel and shorter sight radius. Even closer in, it was less accurate than the SKS and had a loopier trajectory, and it lost even more accuracy in automatic fire. It didn't even fit the Chinese body type very well. That's what a lot of PLA rifle trainers insisted all the way until the 1980s when they finally gave up on the AK. I'm told that the Soviet designers assumed a median Soviet Army conscript who would be about 5'10" and 170 pounds. That's much bigger than the guys that the Chinese army was recruiting. Even in the late 1980s, when the Chinese diet was much richer, a Chinese man of recruiting age averaged 5'5" and 120 pounds. That's 5 inches shorter and 50 pounds lighter than that median Soviet infantryman. On those lighter bodies, a big honkin' Kalashnikov that weighs 10.5 pounds is just a boat anchor. For smaller people, it could weigh close to 10% of the soldier's body weight. And it had that big, nasty 2-pound magazine hanging off the front. And that made a weapon that the PLA already found too inaccurate for their purposes to be even more inaccurate. Now, I know of at least one Chinese marksmanship trainer who still thought that even the SKS was just a bad ergonomic fit for East Asian body types, but at least it was a lot better. What the PLA disliked most of all about the AK was the greater felt recoil. Subjectively, it kicked more than the SKS because that long stroke gas piston that was deliberately overgassed to make it reliable also made it harder to control, gave it less finesse. And the AK-47 in particular, which is what the Chinese adopted, has this off-kilter bore axis that doesn't line up with the stock, so that when the shooter shoots, the recoil impulse goes back over his shoulder instead of into it. Now, the Soviets fixed that problem in 1959 when they transitioned from the AK-47 to this updated AKM, a kind of Kalashnikov 2.0. They fixed that stock angle. They gave it a bayonet. They fixed a lot of the very problems that the PLA was complaining about among themselves that made them dislike the Kalashnikov as anything other than a submachine gun. But the PLA was already so unimpressed with the Kalashnikov and so committed to the SKS that they didn't even follow suit. They never did develop their Type 56 AK into something lighter, more useful, with a bayonet, with better accuracy and a better recoil impulse. By that point, they were already irretrievably committed to the SKS. And we're going to see again and again that over the decades, every time the PLA thought that maybe it was time to introduce some refinements to the basic SKS, something would happen. They would discover that they were already so invested in the SKS that they just had to go back to what they had.